In this post, I'm going to cover the phenomena of the conversation going wrong, what I would call the conversational hurricane. I'm sure you've all experienced conversational hurricanes where you started off with good intentions and all of a sudden the conversation went into a tailspin and people now were reacting as opposed to responding to what you're saying, and vice versa. You're reacting as opposed to responding to what they're saying. So we'll talk about this phenomenon and how it gets triggered, and then we'll talk about, as part of that conversational hurricane, you have to bring in the concept of feeling. So we're going to go through feelings. From there we'll discuss how to look at feelings and how to separate what I call real feeling statements from interpretations disguised as feeling statements. Let's take a look at the dynamics of a conversational hurricane. Everything starts off with our perception, our sense data, kind of the facts of the situation, something that could, again, be video recorded, tape recorded, or instrumented. So we take in some data, something's happening, and we make an interpretation of that. Unfortunately, that interpretation many times, if not always, is biased by our automatic predisposition. And what does that mean? That means we have a kind of a perception or an automatic perspective that's already built in for that person or that situation or that topic. So as soon as that kind of gets triggered by some event, somebody says something, somebody rolls their eyes, we have an emotional response as a result of that interpretation. So our interpretations always drive our emotional response. So again, for example, if I said something to somebody and they kind of replied, but in that reply, let's say they had an eye gesture where their eyes kind of rolled up, right? My automatic predisposition for something like that is I'm being totally discounted. And as a result of being discounted, I'm going to have an emotional response. And out of that emotional response, I'm going to make some kind of a reactive decision. I'm going to react to that, maybe not necessarily be in my best conversational mode. That reaction is going to then trigger another reaction by the other person, and then we're now kind of off and running into a conversational hurricane. So it's one individual's reaction, interacting with another individual's reaction, and if you're not careful, it's like pouring gasoline on a fire. It's going to explode. So what's the built-in mechanism? What's the habits of thought and action that we have as human beings in a situation? The way this kind of comes out for me, based on my research and the readings I've done, we have perceptions, we have sense data. Then those perceptions essentially trigger interpretations. It's how we evaluate life, and we have our evaluative thoughts, and those interpretations then trigger emotional response, and with emotional responses, there's physical reactions, and emotions kind of show up in the body, feelings show up in the body. So when you look at this, let's say over time, and this perception and interpretation gets kind of embedded in us because there's enough recurrence going on with it that we kind of built in then an automatic kind of interpretation to certain kind of sense perceptions. Then we actually develop attitudes or predispositions. Some people might call automatic pilot. And then we have an emotional response that gets triggered like automatically. Even though we have choice in the matter, it's triggered so quickly it doesn't even seem like we have choice. Because we're not even doing those evaluative thoughts anymore. It's kind of built in, it's automatically triggered. So that's kind of the notion of what's behind the conversational hurricane. That's why sometimes you have to have, some deliberation in your conversation. You have to have some distinctions by which to have your conversation. So kind of beginning to get control over this, beginning to get a sense of mastery over this, you got to look at it kind of this way. You have your sense data like before. You have your interpretation. You automatically have your predispositions. So one way to kind of get out of that automatic predisposition, if you know you're going to go into a conversation, is to kind of just tell yourself, suspend it. That may seem hard, but believe it or not, you can suspend automatic predispositions as long as you know you have them, as long as you know that they're there. You can be aware of them, and you can hold them in somewhat of suspended mode. Now, you'll have your emotional response, all right? And at that moment in time, you have a certain choice to make. So something happens, You have your interpretations. You can feel your emotions welling up. What do? Stop, breathe, challenge, and then choose. When you stop and breathe, you now begin to look at and challenge your interpretations. What are you telling yourself? What's your story about this? What are you making up? Almost all stories are made up. In fact, I think all stories are made up, because what's not made up are the facts, because they can be validated by evidence. What is made up is our interpretation of those facts, because 2 people, 3 people, 10 people can see the same set of facts and they can all make up a different interpretation. What other interpretations are possible here? What facts support this interpretation? So these are the things you want to do, and with yourself, you want to kind of slow down the process and essentially then choose your actions or action and respond as opposed to reacting. This is an important part of authentic conversations. It's also an important part of open conversations, because open conversations, you kind of are separating the facts from the interpretations, and you're beginning to go through this whole process of questioning your interpretation. Where does the interpretation come from? Where have you drawn your conclusions from? What conclusions have you drawn? What makes you think those conclusions are valid? And then you act or respond based on the conclusions you've drawn.